Good evening. Today we have a very special feature for you. We will be walking through the life of William Shakespeare, a man who has revolutionized 16th century literature. William Shakespeare is said to be born on April 23, 1564. His mother Mary Arden and father John Shakespeare had 8 children altogether. Around age 11, he attended the grammar school of Stratford, where he studied theater and acting.
Well, early childhood is interesting. His parents are well known. Genealogists have sorted this out. His dad, John, was a glover who rose to prominence. He eventually became Chief Burgess of Stratford-upon-Avon, which was like mayor. The dad married up, marrying Mary Arden, who was from the country gentry, had a fine estate outside of Stratford. They had a nice house on Henley Street. I had the advantage of visiting it when I got to visit Stratford a few years back, a nice place. The earliest children to John and Mary Shakespeare died in childbirth. Shakespeare is the first boy born and the first to survive early childhood.
William Shakespeare started his life early with a marriage at age 18. 3 children followed the marriage. They were Susanna, Hamnet, and Judith. Hamnet, however, passed away at age 11, causing a depression in Shakespeare's life. Although, Shakespeare's best works came after the death of his beloved son.
Shakespeare married Anne Hathaway on November 28, 1582. He was 18 years old and she was 26 at the time, very popular around this time, older female than male. Together they had 3 children, Susanna, Hamnet, and Judith. Around this time, Shakespeare disappeared from all records, and these became known as the lost years.
An accepted possibility for Shakespeare's absence from records was that he poached animals and therefore fled Stratford. In 1588, Shakespeare arrived in London and began to establish himself as a playwright. The group he wrote and acted for was Lord Chamberlain's men.
By 1594, Shakespeare was the main playwright for Lord Chamberlain's men. He was part owner and he earned his money by fees for plays, acting salaries, and company profits.
Shakespeare wrote an astounding 154 sonnets in his lifetime. These were accompanied by plenty of other masterpieces such as comedies and tragedies that changed the way people looked at plays. One of his most famous tragedies is Romeo and Juliet, which is still very well known by common people.
Shakespeare had a great relation with the Globe Theatre. In fact, he pretty much takes it over. He is such a power. When he first comes, he's happy to hitch up with anyone, act, be a bit of a gopher around the theater men. But his talent, his ability, his writing comes out strongly, and he makes the theaters even stronger. The Globe was originally in London proper, but theaters were outlawed by a more puritanical viewpoint of the city fathers. So the Globe is dismantled from its original spot in London. It is drug across the frozen Thames River to Southwark, where they allowed such vices and deviations to occur. They put him over where there was the gambling pits and the houses of prostitution. That's where theater was allowed.
To further your knowledge, we had the pleasure to talk with Dr. Christina Francis of Bloomsburg University.
We're going to start at the end of the career. Shakespeare had spent a certain number of years in London becoming a famous playwright and was quite well known during his lifetime. Many of his plays were actually published in a variety of forms, though the complete works of Shakespeare's plays weren't published until after he had had passed away. And many of the plays at the end of his sort of career in London were sort of the darker plays. So he produced some of the tragedies like Macbeth or Hamlet or King Lear. And then at the end of his career, he wrote a certain number of romances, things like The Tempest or A Winter's Tale or Cymbeline, or plays that people don't know quite as well as some of the more famous ones like Romeo and Juliet. And later in his life, after he had done some of these plays, he returned to his hometown of Stratford-upon-Avon, where he passed away in 1616.
We also decided to provide you with some extra information about the class that Dr. Francis teaches, in the case that some viewers may have an interest in taking this class in the future.
So coming to college and sort of taking a Shakespeare course, you can expect to read a series of plays. A lot of professors, myself included, like to start with some of Shakespeare's poetry. So maybe we'll start with some of the sonnets so that students can get a little bit of a feel for the language in a much sort of smaller, compact space, and some of the images that Shakespeare's interested in, some of the themes that he might be interested in exploring in the larger plays. And then once students become comfortable with the language of the sort of sonnets, which is the same language of the plays, then we start taking the plays one at a time and really sort of reading them very carefully and very slowly, and not just digesting the plot of what happens to this character and that character, but also thinking about some thematic considerations that Shakespeare might have. You know, so you might take something like Romeo and Juliet, and a lot of sort of students think they know the story, but when they start dissecting the play, they realize things like there's imagery connected to Juliet in which she's always associated with the sun, and Romeo is always associated with the moon. And what does that say about the characters? So it sort of tells us that Romeo is always sort of changeable, and just like the moon changes its phases, he's always changing his mind. And Juliet, on the other hand, is always steadfast and fixed and always firm in her decisions and her choices. So taking a sort of class at the college level is really kind of get you into the details of the play and the imagery and the sort of considerations that Shakespeare might have in beyond just the sort of plot. You might read a good 5, 6, 7 plays depending on sort of how fast the students sort of digest the material. But I think by the time you get through a sort of Shakespeare college class, you're going to feel like you really kind of have the tools that you need to have in order to go on and read Shakespeare by yourself.
I hope you enjoyed our show today, and I hope you tune in next time for Johnny Unitas, one of the greatest quarterbacks to ever play the game.